Steve Pruitt is joining us now. He's the managing partner of the consulting firm Watts Partners. He's also a former staff director of the Budget Committee at the U.S. House of Representatives. Steve, a lot of pressing issues facing these world leaders, like reform of the World Trade Organization, climate change, of course, trade. But we talked a little bit, and you heard Stephen talk about it, this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Some want to raise that up as an issue. The Khashoggi murder, Canadian Prime Minister also calling out Trump on the aluminum tariffs. What do you make of all of this?
Well, what you're seeing is U.S. domestic politics impact the entire situation and the story and narrative that the U.S. is trying to paint here. I think that one of the problems that we're going to have is that much of the achievements that may well be reached there on the trade talks are going to be overshadowed, quite frankly, in the American market.
And Stephen, there's been a lot of talk about this joint communique. You heard Stephen's story. You know, there was no joint communique after the APEC meeting in Port Moresby because of disagreements there. Do you think that's also likely at this gathering?
Well, I would find it hard to believe at this point, given the U.S., and I equate U.S. in this instance to the Trump administration, really needing to try and change the narrative here in America. They've been fairly successful over the first 2 years of his presidency of always distracting and changing the narrative. And I think a joint communique would help do that, quite frankly, because it would be something tangible that they could point to as an accomplishment out of these meetings.
A lot of talk about meetings that are not taking place, namely meetings between Trump and the Crown Prince and Trump and Vladimir Putin. Talk to us about that.
Well, obviously, that's part of the narrative that Trump needs to paint right now. Obviously, his domestic situation, both in terms of his handling of the Saudi situation, and now as more information is coming out as a result of the plea agreement that was just reached for Michael Cohen and his discussions with the Russians on behalf of the Trump organization to build a building there in Moscow, those meetings would have only amplified the discussion that we're now debating here in America about the president's truthfulness, the president's ability to continue to serve, and whether or not there will be punitive actions taken against him either by Congress or elsewhere. So I think they need not to have those meetings, quite frankly, because they just don't need those graphics showing on TV.
Yeah, and there is a meeting, though, that is taking place, attracting an awful lot of attention. Of course, that's that dinner meeting tomorrow between President Xi and President Trump. Give me your take on that. Do you expect anything to come out of it?
Well, I'm hopeful that at a minimum we will see a pause in the activity, although a pause really doesn't solve many of the problems that were created by the initiation of this trade war. And I think everybody at this point is now conceded that we are in a trade war. We're no longer shooting at stars, so to speak. So I think if we get a pause out of things and a framework for future negotiations, that would be great. My only concern there coming out of it is that if both sides, the U.S. and the Chinese, are able to treat this as traditional trade negotiations, it's going to be something that, quite frankly, our Chinese friends are going to get played on time and time again as the Trump narrative changing exercise continues, and the need to keep that in front of the American public.
Steve, obviously you watched the congressional races. The Democrats picking up about 39 seats in the House. We've got the GM layoffs. You've got a lot of farmers in the Midwest declaring bankruptcy. Does that change the equation for Trump going into this meeting at all?
Well, first, it's 40 seats, as I understand it, as of today. But secondly, yes, it does change the equation. I mean, I think he's got to now look at the outcomes that were initially anticipated and whether or not those outcomes really do fit the situation today. The fact that this whole trade sanctions and tariffs exercise has been going on in stages rather than able to implement it all at one time has really created an environment that, as it changes, requires changes in the U.S. Negotiating strategy and changes in the expectations for the outcomes. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, given the ideological bent that is driving the current U.S. positions, that they're able and swift-footed enough to make those changes in time to fully react as quickly, quite frankly, as the farmers, the auto sector, and others need a response.
Steve Pruitt, who was great at keeping track of the numbers in Congress when he worked there, still doing a great job of that from New York. Thanks so much for helping.